Hello and welcome to the Squatting Puffin. Last time I messed up, and to fix it I figured I'd best set the record straight. So last time, in my rush to get out a video about Labor Day, I made a mistake about Grover Cleveland by not looking into him quite as deeply as I looked into the history of the labor movement. I left a comment correcting my mistake, but I felt that's just not good enough. I figured the least I can do to clear the name of a dead man is to clear the name of a dead man. This was going to be a 3 to 5 minute, let's clear up the record clip, but the more I looked into him, the more amazing of a president he turned out to be. So, get ready for a short dive into the most interesting president you've never heard of. And there's a reason you've never heard of him. Republicans don't talk about him because he was a Democrat, and Democrats don't talk about him because he governed like a Republican. But as far as I can tell, he was a great president who deserves better. Because this isn't a biography, we'll gloss over much of his pre-president life, so we'll skip his childhood entirely and dive right into some bits leading up to his presidency. In 1862, in his mid-20s, he had practiced enough law to start his own firm. At the beginning of 1863, 1 year later, he was appointed District Attorney of Erie County. Later that year, Congress passed the Conscription Act of 1863 to aid in fighting the Civil War. The act stated that able-bodied men were to serve in the Army, or else they were to hire a substitute. Having just barely been appointed to be District Attorney, he decided on the latter and paid $150, which is a little over $3,000 in today's currency, to a Polish immigrant named Beniński to fight in his stead. You might say, dang, $3,000 isn't much to go die for someone else, but it turns out that wasn't the case. Beniński made it through the bloodiest war of America's history, and Cleveland legally dodged the draft. As he worked his practice, he began to gain some prestige in a few high-profile cases in the mid to late 1860s that started to increase his income nicely. However, rather than using that money for himself, he lived frugally in a boarding house and instead sent much of his income to support his widowed mother and his sisters. In 1881, the municipal government of Buffalo, New York had become full of corruption from both parties. He was approached by the Democratic Party of New York to run for mayor, in an attempt by them to take the seat by fielding a more honest candidate. He refused to run unless a list of disreputable politicians in his own party were removed from the ticket. The party conceded, he won, and became mayor of Buffalo, New York, in January of 1882. His reputation of being an honest, hard-working, good man continued with him, as later that year he ran to become governor of the state and won 5-3 against the other candidate, Charles J. Folger. As governor, his first big act was to veto a bunch of bills, starting with a bill to force railroads to reduce the price of tickets. Lots of people liked this bill, not just because people always like it when the government gives them free stuff, but also because people hated the railroad tycoon, Jay Gould, and he had lately been increasing the price of railroad fare. Cleveland, however, looked at things like a good freaking classical economist and realized that Gould had bought the railroads when they were failing, and by doing unpopular things like that had saved them from bankruptcy. He said it would be unjust to force Gould to charge a lower fare when he was doing what was necessary for the railroads to not collapse and just disappear. This is basic economics, but it's super unpopular with voters who just want the government to give them free stuff. In 1884, 3 years after winning governorship, corrupt politics was the central issue for the presidential election, and his stellar record made him the go-to candidate for the Democrats. That election was between Cleveland and who I like to call Dirty Blaine. That's not his real title, his real name is just Blaine. It was a close election. A mere 600 votes in New York would have flipped their electoral votes and would have changed the outcome of the entire election. And in the popular vote, he won by barely 23,000 votes. The campaign had been a dirty one, because attacks on his character often didn't seem to prevail. He was instead accused of coming from the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Rum referred to the perception that immigrants were alcoholics, though given that the principal sources of immigration at that time were Ireland, Germany, and England, I guess that perception probably still stands in some form or another today. Romanism referred to how many Catholics there were in the Democrat Party. And back then, the U.S. still saw itself as primarily the Protestant nation that had escaped the Catholic control of Europe. It didn't matter that Grover's father was a Presbyterian minister. It's easy for us to forget now, given that the last time a presidential candidate's religion mattered was when Mike Huckabee tried to scare the South with how Romney was a Mormon in the 2008 primaries. But JFK in 1961 became the first non-Protestant president ever elected, almost 200 years after America's founding. And rebellion because the Civil War had been instigated and perpetuated by Southern Democrats upset at Lincoln's election. Glad we got over that. However, the rum, Romanism, and rebellion smear campaign backfired as the Irish and Italian immigrants flooded to the polls in record numbers that year. Blaine also tried to smear Cleveland by digging into his past and spreading a rumor that he had fathered an illegitimate child that he was ignoring. The mother of the child in question was fairly promiscuous, and there were a lot of questions about who the father actually was, as any of several men could have been. But when Cleveland found out, he was like, screw it, who knows who the father is, but the kid needs to be taken care of, and agreed to provide for the boy, eventually helping the boy get adopted after the mother became an insane drunkard. Needless to say, his willingness to help a boy in need rather than arguing about whether or not he was the father ruined the smear campaign. While Blaine was running smear campaigns and looking for any chink in the moral credibility of his opponent, a man approached Cleveland offering to sell him documents that proved Blaine had had a scandalous affair. Cleveland bought the documents from the man, and, in the era before photocopying was a thing, promptly burned the only copy of the documents in front of him. After Cleveland was ultimately elected into the presidency, he started things off with proper reform. In almost all presidencies before him and, frankly, since him, the new president would immediately fire the staff of their predecessor and put in place family, friends, and political supporters. Cleveland did the opposite. He stated any Republican who was doing their job well would not be fired, and that he would not appoint anyone based on their support of him or service to the party. And he stuck by that. As he entered office, there was also a massive bit of corrupt bureaucracy he had to deal with. The government at that time often had large numbers of what were to be temporary employees, in an attempt to prevent permanent bloat to the various agencies and bureaus, but still providing them with the manpower they needed when there was lots of work to be done. However, it had become the practice to create new temporary positions for anyone when their temporary employment ended, or to replace them with more employees and move the original employee to a queue to get another job as soon as possible, and thus they were really permanent employees in a constant state of shifting from one job to another. The system that was supposed to prevent job bloat in the government and provide a natural reduction of expenses over time was instead being gamed to keep slowly ratcheting up the amount of people sucking money out of the system. Cleveland got in, forced them to permanently close a bunch of positions, and refused to hire supporters or people from his party to, quote, fill the gaps, unquote, like every other president who'd promised to do the same had done. The biggest battle he fought over corruption was against the bloated government pensions system. After the Civil War, a lobbying group called the Grand Army of the Republic formed. They did a lot of things, like making Memorial Day a national holiday, but the main effort they lobbied for was pensions for wounded soldiers. This immediately became a carrot that congressmen would use when they would craft bills to widen who could get access to the pensions, often for specific individuals in order to basically buy votes with government handouts. Many past presidents, not wanting to be seen as enemies of the people, would just sign any pension bill that crossed their desk. But Cleveland, who saw tax dollars as a sacred trust of the people, and not just money for the government to give away, inspected every bill that came across his desk and vetoed hundreds of private pension bills, about 3/4 of them. Some of the bills he vetoed included a private pension for a man who had broken his leg while picking dandelions, another who wanted compensation for injuries sustained 23 years before the Civil War started from an exploding cannon in a 4th of July celebration. Others wanted pensions despite having deserted during the war, or despite having no evidence of injury or disability until the day Congress announced they would provide pensions for those suffering from the war. Nothing like suddenly gaining a limp the day you find out you could be paid for it. Now, Cleveland was no Scrooge, as seen with how he treated the boy who probably wasn't his son. He made sure every valid claim that came across his desk was heard and accounted for, but he despised corruption, especially those who would steal from the people's treasure. It was not a popular fight, though. While there was ample corruption in the pension system, it was all dressed up as just helping our soldiers. So it was very easy for his enemies to use the issue to slander him. However, by 1887 he shut down the Blair Bill that was to massively expand the pension system, and after that Congress stopped submitting phony private pension bills to him. In 1888, the next election ramped up, and Cleveland was in for a fight. His opponent, Harrison, had served a distinguished term in the Civil War as a colonel and later a brigadier general, was a skilled speaker, and had the full support of his party behind him. Cleveland, on the other hand, had ostracized and antagonized many of his own party by refusing to play by the cronyism game so long maintained in office. In the 1800s, after the Civil War, no self-respecting Southern Democrat was willing to vote for the party of emancipation, and no freedman or Union vet would vote for the party that started the war. So the swing votes often fell on the shoulders of immigrants and farmers, and while Cleveland had done much work to remove corruption, much of it was not well publicized to the public, and so he was voted out. After he lost the election, Grover and his family moved back to New York, where he took a position working for a law firm, though he did spend much of his time relaxing at a vacation home instead. During the 4 years he was gone, the Harrison administration did some good with the Navy, but had some major economic issues. He passed a bill that normally would have been popular with the Democrats called the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which drastically increased the amount of silver the government was required to purchase up to 4.5 million ounces of silver bullion every month, at a fixed price related to the dollars it could coin with it. The supposed purpose of this was to force inflation to help poor farmers who were struggling to pay off debts due to the deflation of the current economy. But it was really to appease the silver lobby that had wanted a guaranteed customer in the U.S. government for years. The problem was that they had to artificially overvalue the silver in the silver coins and undervalue the gold in the gold coins to get this massive silver exchange to work. Basically, the silver in each silver dollar wasn't worth $1, and the gold in the gold dollars, thanks to inflation, was worth far more than $1. So people started to buy silver dollars for $1, exchange them equally at the Treasury for gold dollars, and then sell the gold on the metal markets for a profit. This continued until the Treasury literally ran out of gold coins regularly. The price of silver also suddenly dropped drastically from $1.16 per ounce to 60 cents per ounce over just a few years. In 1892, elections came up again, and Grover came in rested and ready for a fight. In addition to an unstable economy created by bad money policy that led to pretty bad inflation, many labor unions had begun to riot as well, and several of the riots had become bloody. At this time, the Democratic Party was seen as the party of the unions, and so Grover gained much of their support. Cleveland won decisively and immediately proved once again to be a model of moral character. Cleveland vetoed a bill to give farmers government loans for seed corn, despite having nothing to lose by it and everything to gain politically by it, on the grounds that the Constitution did not sanction Congress nor the President to perform any such act. He argued that private charity existed for that purpose and would do it better, and it turned out he was right. Private organizations did step up and did in fact raise many times the amount that the feds would have provided, very often without the burden of repayment that would have been part of the loans that Cleveland had vetoed. As he entered office in 1893, the gold drain combined with a collapse in railroad stocks to completely destroy the economy. 1/4 of the nation's railroads had suffered major financial disaster and were forced to close at roughly the same time, and $2.5 billion in capital disappeared, leaving over 2 million people unemployed. Over 600 banks also closed their doors permanently due to this breakdown. A riot of hungry protesters calling themselves Coxey's Army, after their leader Jacob Coxey, descended on Washington and attempted to force their way into the Capitol. I guess we have seen this since the Civil War. Maybe Democrats should educate themselves on history. Amid all this economic upheaval, the U.S. Treasury was still under the mandate of the Sherman Act to buy millions of ounces of silver bullion at prices far higher than the market value of silver, and the Treasury was getting close to going bankrupt over it. Cleveland called a special session of Congress specifically to repeal the disastrous Sherman Silver Act. This did not sit well with the silver lobby, even though the law could be directly tied to the impending death of the U.S. Treasury. A fellow Democrat even went so far as to call him an old bag of beef, which I guess is a big insult in the 1800s, but today just sounds like something Biden would call someone asking him difficult questions. In 1894, there was a violent riot by railroad workers called the Pullman Strike. Over 125,000 railroad workers refused to work, paralyzing the nation's commerce. The railroads were used to transport not just goods and people between states, but federally protected mail as well. And since several of the affected railroads were currently going through the federally protected equivalent of bankruptcy, Cleveland felt that it qualified under the power to regulate commerce among the states bit constitutionally. Cleveland announced, if it takes the entire Army and Navy of the United States to deliver a postcard in Chicago, that card will be delivered. He then sent the U.S. Army to stop the riots. This happened right before the 1894 congressional elections, and let's just say it did not win the Democrats any points with the unions. The Republicans won in a landslide, taking full control of the House, and Cleveland was to blame for it. Just as it appeared that the repeal of the Sherman Act was beginning to allow economic recovery, in 1895 a new economic panic hit. More than $20 million in gold had flowed out of the Treasury in about a week, leaving the New York sub-treasury with only $9 million left, and $10 million was about to be withdrawn. This would have put the U.S. government in default and could have triggered a governmental bankruptcy. But J.P. Morgan jumped in and offered the government a loan and a plan to make sure it didn't happen. In the end, the government successfully paid the $10 million. But because of the long-term loans, J.P. Morgan made off with about $7 million in profits from it. Morgan was lambasted for having swindled the government, and Cleveland was raked over the coals for having made a deal with the Gold Devil. These attacks conveniently ignored that Morgan had no vested interest in the U.S. government, as he was so wealthy that he already could have moved anywhere he wanted if the government collapsed. The $0.007 billion that he made from that exchange wasn't even pocket change for the man, with a net worth of $35 billion. But despite all that, he put his resources towards preventing the death of the government, with the help of one of the most morally incorruptible presidents we've ever had. While back in the 1800s the two-term limit was not yet law, Cleveland was preempted from running for a third term due to a complete lack of support within his own party. The Silver Democrats hated him for removing the Sherman Silver Act that they'd worked so hard to get a Republican to pass. The Populist Democrats hated the way he'd fought against the union strikes and vetoed the corn seed loans. The cronies hated him for being so upright and not giving them positions and free jobs. The congressmen hated him for taking away their private pension route to buying votes, and they all had ammunition by publicly twisting the stories about him, about how he hated soldiers and hated farmers and hated workers and how he teamed up with railroad tycoons and more. After his second term ended in 1897, he retired to a quiet private life. In 1907, 10 years later, he fell ill, suffered a heart attack, and died at age 71. His last words were, "I have tried so hard to do right." And for a man of upstanding character who truly exemplified the fight to do what was right, no matter the cost, it seemed an absolute shame to leave my flippant mistake about him uncorrected. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like if you didn't hate it, subscribe if you don't hate me, and share this with people you know because I'm not good enough for YouTube to share things for me. Also, be sure to leave a comment because that's how YouTube knows that the video was good enough for them to share it. I also have a Patreon if you want to be a patron of my content. I don't expect you to support me, but if you wanted to, at the middle tier you can get yourself a mug with butt puffin on it, and it would really help me get some of the production equipment that I lack. Take care, and we'll see you next time.